to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Schwartz. He's at the Department of Biological Sciences and the Computational Biology Department at Carnegie Mellon University. His research interests include simulation methods for molecular assembly systems, methods for analysis of human genetic variation data, and application of phylogenetic methods to study cancer evolution, heterogeneity, and progression. A fairly broad computational biology remit there. But in addition to all of that, his involvement in the ISCB goes back many years, and he's been involved in the education committee for a very, very long time. As you see, he was one of the authors on the original curriculum paper. He's been an active participant for all of that time. And to my knowledge, he was actually the first person to map our initial list of competencies to an existing curriculum and use it to do a thorough gap analysis. I think we're going to go a little bit more about that now. So he's basically going to relate to how he used the competency profile to rethink how bioinformatics is taught to molecular biology students at Carnegie Mellon. Russell, over to you.
So thank you for having me here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my efforts, largely with my colleague Bob Murphy at Carnegie Mellon University, rethinking how we teach computational biology skills to what I'm calling molecular biology students, which would be undergraduates in our biology department. So we just heard about the competencies. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but I will just show one thing that's kind of helpful in summarizing a bit, and that is that you can roughly group these competencies into some major categories. A few of them are more or less competencies in biology or biotechnology, a few more or less in computational biology, really at the intersection, a few more or less computer science, and a few more or less professional competencies. And that's not quite a perfect mapping. It's good enough for the purposes of some summary I need to give later, so just remember that for a moment. So what we wanted to be able to do, and this really predates the competencies, what we wanted to be able to do is to modernize our biology education. I think it hopefully doesn't need any defense for this audience that biologists of the future are going to need to know a lot more about computation than was the standard until fairly recently. We're trying to stay ahead of the curve there. So what we wanted to do is come up with a standard for how to train our biology undergraduate students. And not just the ones specializing in computation, but the average or lowest common denominator. So what does every student need to know? And to help explain this, we created a new persona here. So this, I'm calling this a bioinformatics user. It's really not quite, this is one of the profiles where we kind of debate is this a user or a scientist. But basically this is our new profile, Angela. And Angela would be an undergraduate biology student, fairly typical of the cohort we get. She might have entered with the idea that she probably wants to go into medicine, but when she started learning more about biology, she discovered she really loves research. So now maybe she's debating, does she want to do medicine, does she want to do research, does she want to do both? She's largely focused on laboratory science, largely wants to be a wet lab scientist, but she understands that she needs to know something about data analysis and bioinformatics, genomics, and so forth to do this. So in terms of these kinds of profiles, she has activities that largely have her doing wet lab work, maybe as a lab technician doing undergraduate research, and she wants to be prepared for the future. Getting into a good graduate or medical school would be her immediate next step, but she would be thinking ahead what she would want to be doing. We would be assuming she's coming in with little or no computational training. She may never have used the command lines, and largely she's familiar with GUI work, and that would be the kind of student we're preparing to serve. So to serve this population, we largely focused on developing a single computational biology class. And this is something we did a number of years ago, predating these competency efforts. And I know there are different models about how to do this. Some places you develop a class in computational biology for your biology students. Many of us would argue that a better model might be to integrate computation into all of the traditional biology curriculum, but that's often a challenge because in lots of places there aren't too many faculty in a biology department who know a lot about computation. So this is often an easier way to start if you're maybe the only one or one of the only ones in your department who's really a computational biologist. So we set up a class that's split into two halves. One half is largely genomics and molecular biology, so basically working with biological data to a large degree. The other half modeling and image informatics. I'm not going to go into any great detail about what that covers because I want to get into how this relates to the competencies. So just as we have these competencies we work with, anyone who's designing classes today is probably dealing with the concept of having to come up with learning objectives for our classes. So we have a set of learning objectives that describe what we want to accomplish here. And you might see a lot of similarity between some of our learning objectives and the ISCB competencies. So learning about major biological data types, how they're produced and their uses, learning to critically assess reliability of data sources and so forth. And I tell the students about these learning objectives, but I also like to tell them the unofficial learning objective of the class, and there's only one, and that is that we want them to know what they need to know about computational biology to be the best biologists they can be. And that's really crucial for dealing with this particular cohort. We're not trying to turn them into computer scientists, we're trying to make them the most effective biologists they can be, and that involves learning quite a lot about computation. To some degree, learning about tools that are available to them, and a tool might literally mean a particular program, but more often it might be a class of algorithm, might be a source of data to which we apply these algorithms, and we really try to emphasize that to a large degree a tool is a way of thinking. So being able to think abstractly about a problem, be able to think in terms of a mathematical representation, be able to think in terms of statistical reasoning, these are things we're trying to convey in the class. They need to know what kinds of problems they can solve with these tools, so how this can feed into, let's say, experimental design in the laboratory. And to do that, they need to know something about the quantitative material. They need to know some computer science, not at the level of a computer science student, some statistics, so that they can design experiments, abstract problems, interpret outputs, and so forth. And one of the things that's maybe a surprise to many of my biology colleagues when we talk about these things is that they also need to learn a fair amount of biology. So in teaching this class, you might think these are students getting a whole undergraduate biology curriculum, we should be teaching them computing. That is absolutely not the case. I'd say probably a third of the time I spend teaching in this class, I'm teaching them about biology and biotechnology. They're not learning in other classes, but that's really important to understand how computation would work in their field. So that basically is what we're trying to cover, and then we can start reasoning about how a class like this is helping us better serve the needs of that particular cohort in terms of our different competencies. I've just put together a matrix here outlining the competencies across the top here, and again there's that labeling, more or less biology, computational biology, computer science, and professional competencies, and these are our learning objectives. So I don't have Bloom's taxonomy terms here, but basically just trying to show where an objective is hitting a competency. And you can kind of see that we're mostly hitting in the computational biology area, repeatedly intersecting our objectives to the competencies, a little bit in the computer science, some in the biology, not so much in the professional development. And sometimes that's okay because these are students who are taking a full undergraduate curriculum. And in other places that curriculum is going to be hitting on competencies we've missed. So of course, undergrad biology students are getting a lot of the biology training that is not being taught in our particular class. They're actually also getting computer science training we don't teach. So we also require our biology students to take a semester of computer programming. So they are getting some of that. And they're getting professional development of various kinds in other places in the curriculum. But there are still some gaps that we're not hitting effectively in this particular combination of our class and the other classes, and this is where the competencies can be really helpful to us. So we can observe that they're not getting this competency K that more or less refers to development of complex software systems, and this would be a case where we would say, well, that's fine. This is not a cohort that we would expect to be trained to develop large software systems, so this particular persona doesn't need that competency except at a very basic level. We're also not giving them this competency P, which refers to continuing professional development. Again, this is something they're going to need, but it's something their next training program or their career beyond that is probably going to be giving them. And then competency M is an interesting one. So this is a competency more or less on ethics as it applies to bioinformatics, genomics, and so forth. And this is something that's missing from the curriculum. It's not in our class. It's not elsewhere in the curriculum. They're getting ethics training in other topics, but not specifically in genomics ethics. And this is something that we can really look at and say, okay, we have to start teaching this in our class. This is something they need to know. They're not getting elsewhere. So that's kind of how the competencies can help us, and help us start thinking about how to develop our class as well as how that class can fit better into an overall curriculum. And in development of this class, we of course have been working with the rest of our department to repeatedly refine this and try to integrate this better into a larger biological sciences undergraduate curriculum. So this is where our overall curriculum stood when we first started developing this class, when we first made it a requirement of our biologists some years ago. They would take computational biology typically pretty late in their studies after what was more or less a traditional molecular biology education. They would get some other advanced training also pretty late in their studies, too late to use it in our class and too late to use our class in informing other courses in the curriculum. And we have made a number of improvements, not just Bob Murphy and I, but others in our department working with them to improve the training in a variety of ways. To move computational biology earlier in the curriculum so they could take advantage of it in later classes, and especially in undergraduate research. To put more computationally relevant and especially statistically relevant mathematics very early in the curriculum, so we can assume that when we're taking computational biology and build on that. And we're continuing to try to do this. So our next step that we hope to have ready by this point, but I think it'll happen next year, is to move computer programming earlier so we can then do a lot more in computational biology by being able to assume our students enter computational biology already knowing how to write at least a basic computer program, something we can't know now, or we can't assume at this point. And so this is a kind of gradual process. It's not something we can undertake ourselves. It's something that really needs the cooperation of our whole department. In some cases, other departments like our mathematicians and statisticians can work with us on other aspects of our training. But it's a work in progress, and one where the competencies have been very helpful to us in thinking about what we're trying to do and what we could be doing better. So I'll just wrap up with some conclusions here. Again, I hope it doesn't need to be justified here that the future of biology is going to be much more quantitative and data-driven than the past and the present of biology, and undergraduate training has really lagged behind where it needs to be to prepare students even for biology of today, much less biology of 20 or 30 years from now. So this is something where I think our community has a lot we can do to try to improve the standards of how biology teaching is accomplished. Specialized computational biology, like our class, is one component of this, but if you want to do this successfully, you can't be working in isolation. You have to be thinking about it in terms of a broader curriculum for a cohort like this, and you really have to bring your colleagues on board with this. Finally, just wanting to do this isn't enough. You have to want to do it, and you have to know what you want to do and have a good argument for why we're providing particular kinds of training, and that is really what these competencies and these workshops have been all about. Trying to talk to the community to figure out not just how to get these things taught, but what we should be teaching. And this still is a work in progress, where I think there's a lot more to be done to figure out exactly what we should be teaching, what the different personas are that need to be taught, and I hope we'll learn a lot more about this after we're all done speaking here today. So thank you.
So do you have a sense for how many times you need each one of those competencies during the whole entire course of study? Is that, can you look at that at all, or is there any answer to that?
The short answer is no. We don't really know. Anecdotally, we can say that reinforcement is certainly helpful. It's good if we don't just teach them statistical concepts once and they never see it again. If they're seeing it in their research, they're seeing it in a genetics class, say, afterwards. again, anecdotally, it's better, but I don't really have any data to support that.
Everything good?
Yep.